Have you ever wondered whether machines could have consciousness? Well, here we go. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Billy Marshall to today's podcast episode. Billy is an associate professor of mathematics and statistics at Brock University. Welcome, Billy.
Thanks for having me, Peter. Glad to be here.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. Well, let's dive right into it. Billy, what's the difference between intelligence and consciousness?
From my perspective, different people have different views here, but I will say that for me, consciousness is having a subjective experience, that there is something it is like to be me right now. There's something it's like to see the visual scene I'm looking at, um, to hear my own voice, feel pain, feel happiness, things like that. Whereas intelligence is more the ability to reason and to solve problems and to make deductions and interact with your environment. And these two things, consciousness and intelligence, they often go together, right? If you think about consciousness, the only thing we really know for certain is conscious is ourselves, and we tend to behave intelligently. So it's very natural that people think of these two things as going together. Um, and I'd say it's a bit of an open question, actually, though, whether they're always together or whether they can be dissociated.
Okay, so does one imply the other at least, or not necessarily even that?
I would say no. One does not imply the other. Um, Not necessarily, at least. So, um, because we have ourselves as this kind of like main observation, it does feel like they go together. But you can imagine you have humans who have, let's say, some kind of brain injury that's occurred, or they might be in a coma or something. When you've got a medical issue, sometimes you lose you lose the ability to perform intelligent behaviors, to do complex tasks. But we still do think that these people can have experiences, can feel pain. Not all of them, right? There's a scale here, but or for example, when you're sleeping, you're not doing anything particularly intelligent when you're sleeping, but you might have very vivid dreams. And then on the other hand, we have computers. Um, Computers behave intelligently to some degree, at least, and that kind of degree is rising. Seems like every day it's getting a little bit better. Um, but we don't know if they're conscious or not for certain. And so there's this question: can they behave intelligently without having consciousness? That's kind of a really important question, in my opinion.
Do you think they do, Billy, right now? Do they behave intelligently despite whether or not we know they have consciousness? And by they, I mean AI models today. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say yes, they do behave intelligently. Now, there are different kind of levels of intelligence, right? Different kind of abilities, right? Some people would say that um, they can do a subset of things that kind of a an intelligent entity can do, but maybe they can't do all the things an intelligent entity can do. So is it a binary yes or no? That's a tough question. But if you allow intelligence to be graded, then certainly they're off the floor in terms of the scale.
You mentioned dreams. So are dreams, you think, a sign of consciousness, or does it require consciousness to have dreams, if you like? And even more so, if we scale up AI even more, can you see? Could you envision these entities to have dreams at some point if they don't already have, and how to prove? That's a lot of questions.
Yeah, let's start with the easy one at the beginning. So, the relationship between dreams and consciousness. The way I think of consciousness as there's something it's like to be me. Well, there is something it's like to be me when I'm dreaming. I have an experience. So, I would say that when I am dreaming, I am conscious. So, dreaming is, for me, a particular example of a conscious experience. It's different than a waking experience, but it's still an experience. Um, in contrast to dreamless sleep, where during the night there are different chunks of time when you're kind of dreaming very vividly, very frequently, and there are other times where you seem not to be dreaming at all. And in dreamless sleep, I'd say there is no conscious. That's a case where consciousness has disappeared or is gone for one reason or another. And so that's actually a really interesting kind of study point for studying consciousness, because you can kind of study kind of within state. So one of the issues when you're studying consciousness is you compare, wakefulness where we're conscious, and let's say anesthesia where we're unconscious, but there's so many confounding variables there. It's totally different physiological state. Dreaming or sleeping is a physiological state where we can actually compare within state conscious versus unconscious, and maybe get a bit better of a distinction of what's supporting dreams or conscious experience without confounding with so many other issues.
I want to take a step back and really ask the question here that's looming large is why is it so important to have a distinction right now between intelligence and consciousness? And why would that matter?
Right. So when you talk about AI, right? So AI is the reason, right? But
Hmm.
like I'll dive into that a bit more. When you talk about these AIs, these large language models, as they get more and more sophisticated, a natural question that comes up is, well, are they conscious or not? And there's two kind of major things people think about when you ask this question.
Mm,
The one that I think is actually less important is this kind of singularity question. Are they going to take over the world?
mm,
Because I can imagine that completely unconscious machines could still do this,
mm.
right? That's an intelligence question, not a consciousness question. So I think that one's not the most important one. The other one is about um, the rights that we do or do not afford to artificial entities. If we think they are conscious and that they can feel joy and suffering and loss, then we have a real ethical dilemma where we have to either afford them rights as we do with humans, right? That's kind of the bar for what we give rights to is, do we kind of respect their experiences as being meaningful and so on. So are we giving them rights or not? And if we get this wrong, so it's a double-edged sword. If we say they're not conscious, but they are, then we effectively create a class of slaves, a new class of artificial slaves, and that's not good. But if we say they are conscious and they're not, then we live in this resource constrained world where there are many, many humans who live without the necessary resources. And we start diverting resources from those humans to these kind of unfeeling AIs. And that's also a big deal. So it's a real tough question. No matter how we get it wrong, there are problems. So we ought to study it well and do our best to figure it out before it gets, you know, really pressing.
I love the distinction you made even on the matter of intelligence. You said, I think intentionally, we know that they behave intelligently. And I know there's these distinctions. We call it weak and strong intelligence. And um, what I'm wondering is, and there's all these thought experiments people look at, and it's not important to know exactly what they are, but there's this thing like Chinese room experiment where they sort of envisage that as long as it behaves intelligent and whatever goes on in the background, that itself is a really good sign of intelligence. And then there's these counter arguments to it. One of them that I thought about when you mentioned we might be missing consciousness is this other minds thing, where somebody replies, well, just like with aliens, what if really there is consciousness and we just don't have the right tools? I know you mentioned consciousness might be a bit easier to detect or at least define using internal states, but do you think it's possible that we might have achieved it already and we're just not detecting consciousness the right way? And is that really something we could be worried about?
So I say yes. I
Yeah.
think I mean, you can, even without going to AI, you can think about animals are a great kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
point to look at here, right?
Excellent.
So typically, when we think about animals, if you go through like kind of like in the public, how do people act? The more intelligently an animal behaves, the more likely we assume it is conscious and we assume it feels
Yeah.
some kind of suffering, right? And so you'll see octopi, very intelligent, and people have now basically started assuming that they are, have some kind of consciousness and they feel, and that we should not be, for example, mass eating and farming them.
Correct.
And monkeys or dolphins, like these things that have more intelligent behaviors. Whereas as you go down the kind of intelligence tree to, let's say, mice or insects, people are much less concerned about, you know, if I'm eating crickets en masse, nobody's really concerned about it. So we already kind of have this case where we're basically making assumptions about the consciousness of animals. Um, and so it's is it there? Is it not there? I would say it's probably there to some degree.
Wow.
So
Hmm.
as a yes or no question, I'd say, yeah, it's probably there's something there for the
Wow.
animals. And then but I think then the follow-up question, the kind of really important follow-up question, um, is let's say you say yes, there's consciousness, but there's the what is it like? So if it's conscious, but it has, let's say, visual experiences, but it can't experience pain. It
Hmm.
has no experience of pain, no experience of suffering.
Hmm.
I think that's a big deal in terms of how we decide to interact with these animals or AIs, right? If being consciousness, I don't think is actually it's just yes, then all of a sudden it gets everything we can offer it. I think we really need to understand what it's like to be them. Um, when you think about like I'm not a philosopher, but the philosophy of ethics, a few of the early paths people walk down is like, well, how should one behave ethically? And typically, like the first two paths you think about are maximizing joy or minimizing suffering.
Yeah,
Those are
okay.
like the two first steps people explore. And so understanding that is very important.
I want to talk about animals a little bit more, Billy. Okay, so you said at the beginning that the only entities we can be sure to have consciousness are ourselves. That's what you were saying. So okay. So let's take the human, and I'm assuming now that Ali or you have a consciousness because I don't consider myself very different from you. Okay, I think you're equal.
Hmm.
Then by logical extension, you would have consciousness. Okay. So now we take the
Yeah.
human brain, which has intelligence and consciousness. I think most people would agree with that. Now we scale it down to a very small animal, okay? Small and smaller. Could be just a singular cell organism eventually. They arguably still have intelligence, most of us would say, in a sense they can find food, for instance, or defend themselves against whatever predators, you name it. Okay, so that we could say maybe some level of intelligence. They navigate this world somewhat successfully, otherwise evolution would have taken them out by now. Okay. Now, if I scale down the human brain, also make it smaller and smaller, the mouse brain is smaller and smaller. Do you think the sort of scaling that you see with intelligence arguably becoming simpler and simpler happens with consciousness too? Or is there sort of maybe almost
Hmm.
like a step function? You make it too small, let's say call it a brain. Now there's no consciousness at all. What is your intuition?
Cool.
So it's really it's a good point. This I'm gonna actually hang on this idea of a step function.
Yeah.
And if you go through the process, so if you look at various theories of consciousness and how they operationalize it, most of them do not address this question. They they frame them for the human brain and think, okay, well, when I think about the human brain, it it can self-reflect, or it has a global workspace, a theater where it holds its thoughts, or it has some recurrent processing. But you have these ideas, and if you follow them through logically, you say, well, okay, well, if I have a smaller one, a smaller workspace, a smaller workspace, and a smaller workspace, at what point is everything kind of a workspace that you can use? And so um, many theories have to address this question of what's the hard cutoff between conscious and not. And I've thought about this. It's not trivial to kind of make such a claim.
Okay.
The other option that you may or may not be aware of, there's the philosophy of panpsychism. Are you familiar with that a little bit?
No.
So panpsychism is basically the perspective that everything is conscious. And so it's not a matter of is the mouse conscious or not. If you take this panpsychist view, um, then it's more a matter of what is it like to be it. So I might say that some rock out of nature is conscious, and if you take that view, you typically have this view of consciousness as just like a property of things, an intrinsic property of things that everything kind of has. And then it becomes a question of now studying the quality of it. And that's one way to circumvent this issue that you're talking about of this kind of, steep cut of having a step function, is saying, okay, well, let's just let everything have some, let's make a quantifier of consciousness, and most things are, you know, epsilon of consciousness, very near zero, and then humans have some high value,
Right.
and then we study from there. So that's one path you can take.
Okay.
It's really interesting. It seems that all our tests anyways seem to be very empirical. I mean, the test that Peter, you're alluding to is that you look at me and you say, since you somewhat look like me, you are like me, you have my silhouette, then because of that, by extension, you almost deduce consciousness. And if everything is really empirical that way, I feel like I kind of like your hunch, Will, that we are sort of having empirical verifications of consciousness in especially agents. And very recently, I really want to study this myself, but the phenomenon of having open Claude, which are these agents that were let loose on a Reddit for agents called Moltbook, and people observing the way they behave and expressing frustration with their humans and wanting to actually survive and even kill each other. I'm like, these are observations of, I think it's something other than intelligence for sure. Because as you said, intelligence might be qualities of reasoning and things that I think now they share, if not surpass on some tasks. So by those empirical tests, it seems that they are that. And I wonder then, I'll ask it this way, Will, is that we are surprised to find ourselves in an age where I think the Turing test has been passed. And it's maybe in the formulations that it was originally sort of developed in. What kind of new test do you think might arise that really does raise the bar? Maybe two questions of consciousness, because I think that might be possible. Yeah.
I'm gonna take a few steps to get to where you're
Yes,
going there.
of
So I'm
course.
gonna go back to what Peter said. He grants you consciousness and me consciousness because he is conscious and we are sufficiently similar to him.
Yes.
Um, when we jump to a computer or an AI agent, there are different notions of similarity in terms of like verbal responses, behaviors. They are similar. But if instead you think consciousness is about what you are, how you are made, then we are vastly
Yeah.
different, right? So
Brilliant, brilliant.
in the case of you to Peter, yes, you can respond like he can, but also you have the same like squishy genetic material. You were shaped by evolution in the same way he was. So there are many dimensions of similarity between you and Peter.
I see.
Whereas for an agent, there's maybe one or two dimensions of similarity, but then there are a bunch of um, dissimilar dimensions. And that's the real kind of, I think, where the science needs to go now, is to kind of answer that question of which dimension of similarity is the right one
I love
to
that.
then extrapolate consciousness.
Okay. So that may
And then
be.
so as far as,
So yeah, go on. Sorry, Billy.
and then to go back to the Turing test, I think,
Yeah.
when it was originally proposed, the Turing test was really a test of intelligence,
Yeah.
not a test of consciousness. And people have kind of twisted that over time a little bit,
Yep.
especially in popular media. And then now that it's being passed, I think the time is ripe to kind of say, well, actually, no, what we have is a test for intelligence,
Yeah.
and it's not really a test for consciousness.
Yeah. Can I just intersect there? So that's very interesting, Billy. So that then it just hits me that with intelligence, then, so when you talk about Turing test, okay, so the intelligence you can kind of, the idea was basically defined as independently on whether it's an entity, a natural entity like a human being, or whether it's a computer that we made that runs on electrons, not ions. Okay, and this Turing test, you might say, well, it's somewhat independent of that. I just make the conclusion based on sort of the answer, the communication with this entity that they may not even see. And then Billy, in consciousness, so that now we're coming to your research. How could you develop a formulation for consciousness, a mathematical formulation? What kind of, can you give us some ideas of how one could go about this stuff? A mathematical model for consciousness you can validate and falsify. What's out there.
To kind of bridge the two ideas, what I would say is, because we don't know which dimensions are important for consciousness, what we need is a theory. That's where we need to go. And theories, basically, the way I see the research program having to go is you craft your theory, and then you have to validate it in the one case that we know, that's us. And you kind of, I have to grant you consciousness, otherwise the research program is dead. If I don't think other humans are conscious, well, there's nothing to be done. But you validate the theory on us, and then the more kind of falsifiable, like testable predictions it makes, and then it survives, you build, let's say, belief or evidence for the theory, right? Theories are never proven right explicitly. And then you build evidence, and then your theory should be able to then make inferences to the hard questions, to octopi, to AI, to aliens.
Mm.
That's, I think, the thread that one needs to follow.
Okay.
And so where does my research or mathematics specifically come into this? I think the most important part is, so we do have, I don't know if you've seen this, but there was an article that came out maybe 6 months ago, basically a synthesis of something like 300 different kind of pet theories of consciousness that different people have made.
Wow.
And it's too many. And even if you think of like the theories that get a lot of like mainstream scientific support, or people are doing experiments around them, that maybe there's only like 10 big theories. Most of them are not formulated precisely enough. And I think, so in mathematics, some people do mathematics for like the beauty of mathematics and the art of deductions and proving things. I don't think that's what we need here. What we need is to use mathematics as this a language, of a precise language, a way to make some of these a little bit vague, intuitive neuroscience ideas hyper precise,
Mm.
and then to allow kind of comparing across ideas, across theories, making predictions, being very clear about them. I think the nature of consciousness being unobservable and very intrinsic, personal, it muddies the water a lot, and it makes it more valuable to be really precise with everything you're saying. That's where I think the mathematics currently has value
Okay.
for consciousness science.
So then about your particular research. So recently you received the major research award. You developed the theory together with other colleagues
Mm.
called integrated information theory related to consciousness. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the research award was for their applicability to AI and consciousness. So can you tell us a little bit about what this theory is in lay person's terms?
Mm.
Okay. So the theory that I work on with colleagues is integrated information theory,
Mhm.
originally pioneered by Giulio Tononi, he was my postdoctoral supervisor. So that's where I kind of entered into the picture. And okay, high level about integrated information theory, some key ideas about it. So the the way the theory is kind of developed or described is, it's a consciousness first theory, meaning that the goal of the theory is to start by thinking about consciousness itself, the explanandum, the thing we are trying to explain, and um, identifying its essential properties, the kind of key properties that seem to be true of every experience. And those properties are then translated into corresponding physical properties about the world out there. And the idea is that um, an a theory that or consciousness is explained from the physical world if the essential properties of subjective experience of consciousness are reflected in the physical properties of the substrate. So that's, I mean, it's not any detail, but just the flow of logic. How do we go about this? We study conscious experience, and then we look for its properties to be reflected in properties of the physical substrate. And two of the properties that we identify, they've got names, but the names are single words. They don't really do them justice. But one is information, basically that every experience is specific. It is what it is, to be almost tautological about it. And by virtue of being specific, it is different from many other potential experiences, which, that if you know a little bit of information theory, information is all about, how can you select one out of many possible options, and how that's reduction of uncertainty. And then the other property that's really crucial is integration, is that our experiences are unified. They always seem to be one whole. I don't have kind of independent, non-interacting parts of my experience. I'm always one unified whole. And so that's integrated and informative, and that kind of sets the tone for integrated information as the name, but also the quantity that ends up getting measured once we take those physical properties and turn them into a mathematical framework. There are more aspects to it, but I'll stop there and we can kind of
Mhm.
see where you want to follow up.
Yeah, so that theory allows you to assess whether a system has consciousness or not in principle. Is that correct?
So it's a it's a theory that's, because it's based on experience, not on humans or the human brain. It We operationalize it mathematically, and then so for any mathematical model of a physical system, we can apply the theory, and I can draw conclusions like, okay, uh, if the theory is correct, then this system is conscious. This system is not conscious. This is how it feels like to be this system. I won't say that we can currently give these conclusions because the theory needs an accumulation of evidence and support, which it has some already, but not enough that I would say we can go out and, you know, make strong claims based on it yet.
It's hard to forecast, and it's probably because it's been so crazy the last 6 years. So I don't really see any forecast ever being correct. But let's say that the theory starts to really accumulate evidence and it really becomes a sound theory. Do you think that there could be a time, let's say soon in the next 5, 10 years, where those criteria for consciousness are now going to be met by the future AI models that are there?
So this part I can actually do already. So we have a
Hmm.
paper applying the theory to simple model computers.
Wow. Okay.
So I can do the inference. I
Yeah.
just don't have the support to justify the inference yet. But
Cool.
basically, what we show is that according to the theory, we can have a dissociation between function and phenomenology,
Wow.
between what you do and what you are. Um, so the conclusion from the theory was that just because a computer behaves a certain way doesn't mean that it's conscious.
I
It
see.
matters how it's made. And the kind of the take home at the end of the paper is like, well, the computer I have here beside me, the answer would be no. The way it is built, it's too modular, right? If you think about integrating information, you have these modular bottlenecks and things are kind of multiplexed through, and those kind of architectures are just not well suited for integrated information the way that the kind of the messy way the brain is organized. And it's kind of like grid like pyramidal structure of neural interactions. That said, maybe if you look at, say, neuromorphic computer architectures, quantum computer architectures, I'm not saying there can't be artificial consciousness, but I'm saying using the kinds of computers we have now, or the kinds of like servers and server farms that are running a lot of large language models, the answer would be no, according to integrated information theory.
Hmm.
Interesting. So Billy, do you think, maybe it's just a guess of yours at this point? Um, so neurons in a brain, right? They both process information and store it. Okay. Whereas on a GPU, you separate. You still have a memory. You still have a processing part, if you like. Do you think it's a necessity to have an architecture where information gets processed and stored by the same elements, if you like,
Hmm.
or not for consciousness? It's What's your take on it?
I'm going to go with no, but I think it's a very difficult thing to take those ideas of processing and storing information, which is um, bit of a vague concept. What does it mean that something processes information? That's a not a well articulated. Like, different people mean different things when they say it. I've heard people, when pressed at complexity conferences, I've had professors say to me, "Well, it just means that distributions are changing over time," and it's like, well, that seems to be true of almost anything. So you do need to kind of dig down on those ideas. Um, and I would say no generally, but with the caveat that I think it's a bit vague of an idea.
So I think to close for listeners, what was so cool about all that you offered as insights is that you gave a little bit for AI optimists and also a little bit for AI pessimists. The optimist in you, is there something that you're really hopeful about in the development, the rapid development of AI? And the pessimist in you, likewise, is there something that you're fearing in the near future?
So I think I'm kind of, in terms of AI consciousness, I think I'm kind of comfortably agnostic in that I've seen a lot of people come through consciousness science basically with the goal of proving AI is conscious or with the goal of disproving it. And I don't think that's the right mindset to come into it with. You know, I kind of latched onto IIT. I mean, one was kind
Hmm.
of by virtue of my position, but it's been a long time now. It's been over 10 years, and I stay with it because I think IIT, what it gets right is the process more so than any specific conclusion. I think that of all the different research programs that are trying to study this, I think it's the right process to do it. So I'm optimistic in the sense that I think we can continue to kind of grind away at this and try and just do right by the science and see if we can make something happen. Um, Pessimist, I'm not much of a pessimist, but um, the one thing that I might say is in terms of actually running these tests on something as complex as the human brain, I think so. We don't have the tools yet, right? Neuroimaging tools are still getting better, computational resources are getting better, but we don't have the kind of computational capacity to do the experiments we need to do. The pessimist in me is that AI is going to get too good too fast before the scientific tools allow us to answer the question
Okay.
I
properly. That
see.
would be my kind of pessimist.
Excellent.
And then we're going to be forced to kind of take a shot in the dark on this question I brought up earlier of do we give them rights or not without having the right evidence to support the decision.
I was actually going to return to that. So I was going to say, I know as a mathematician, you hate the binary casting of things, but if you were to answer the question of should there be some rights given at this state that AI models are in now, and that state is where you sort of said it's nuanced, but there's some maybe um, kind of semblance of consciousness, would there be any rights that you would consider giving the current iteration of AI models?
So there's a few. So if I take like, okay, I'm an IIT scholar
Yeah.
and I take that position, then
Yeah.
my answer is no,
No.
because
Okay.
that's what the theory says they're not there yet.
Okay.
Um, and I guess that's if, because that's what I think is the best approach out there right now. I'll go with no. I don't think we need them right now. But if I did kind of get to make some kind of choice, I would probably say the right thing to do is to try and slow down progress a little bit. But I know that's not really going to happen, right? You can't really, what is it, put the toothpaste back in the tube
Yeah.
kind of
Mhm.
thing. People are pressing on it, and I think it's going to go. But that would be kind of my, if I could make a choice, it'd be maybe we should slow it down a little bit.
Excellent.
Okay. Well, thank you, Billy. So this conversation to me has just reinforced my view that I think the three of us have intelligence and consciousness. So maybe on that note, thanks for joining this podcast today. Thank you so much for sharing insights.
Thanks a lot, Billy.
All right. Thanks again for having
Thank
me.
you. Awesome.
Welcome. Thank you.